coming up.
This was the movie business. Kids killing their parents.
The murder case the whole world is talking about.
Neither were abused. They've made that up.
Why so many people now say the Menendez brothers
I hope they're gonna get out.
aren't villains, they're victims.
I believe Erik and Lyle Menendez.
Bob, seems to have been almost a lifelong obsession for you. What is it about this story that keeps you coming back?
I've covered the Menendez case for 35 years. I began with following the investigation in the fall of 1989, 35 years ago. And I attended each trial of the Menendez brothers. Each trial was 6 months long, and I was there every day. And what really keeps me coming back is that I knew this ended in a miscarriage of justice with the murder convictions in 1996. That should not have been the outcome of this case. This case should have ended with 2 manslaughter convictions, and Erik and Lyle Menendez still would have been sent to prison for 22 years. And instead, they've been incarcerated for almost 35 years, and that's simply wrong.
Of course, you know better than most that not everyone agrees with you, that not everyone agrees that this was a manslaughter case, not a murder case.
I'm well aware of that. I was talking in the very beginning, back in the early 90s, I was talking to the prosecutors who no longer have any interest in talking with me because I've taken a stand. I was going on TV shows in the 1990s on Oprah, on Donahue, and I was saying, I believe Erik and Lyle Menendez, but that belief was not simply based on their testimony at trial. As a book author, I had the luxury of being able to spend a large amount of time with the sister of Jose Menendez, Marchcano, and the sister of Kitty Menendez, Joan Vandermolen, and they filled me in on what the real story was with this family, and it was not the perfect all-American family. Now, many people thought that because the Menendez lived in a mansion in Beverly Hills, the brothers were nationally ranked tennis players. Kitty Menendez was a former beauty queen who was very involved in charities. Everybody thought this was the perfect all-American family. And behind the gates of that mansion, it was a very different story. And the real story was a dysfunctional family was spinning wildly out of control. But because they lived in that mansion in Beverly Hills, because they had a lot of money, everybody thought they were great.
As you say, the extended Menendez family, mostly, almost like 99% of them, believed the boys, Erik and Lyle, were molested. But nobody actually saw that firsthand, did they?
Well, typically, somebody who molests children does not invite other people into the bedroom to watch them.
You're trusting the opinions of people who knew the Menendezes. Is that what it came down to for you?
Besides the testimony of Erik and Lyle Menendez, I spent a lot of time talking with members of their family. And the problem in the family was that Jose Menendez was the rich uncle in the family. He would loan you money if you needed it. If your kid needed their first job, Uncle Jose would take care of it. And nobody ever wanted to upset the rich uncle because you never knew when you might need the rich uncle. And so nobody had ever sat all these relatives together in one room to compare notes about what they knew about the Menendez family until this terrible tragedy happened. And at that point, the defense attorneys sat all the relatives together. They flew them in from around the country, and they sat down in one room, and they all started comparing notes, and they realized this was a very dysfunctional family, and they knew that Erik and Lyle were telling the truth.
Did they find anyone amongst the family who had anything nice to say about Jose at that time?
Jose Menendez's sister, Marchcano, still loves him very much, still talks glowingly about him, but she also says that she believes Jose was mentally ill and that everything that Erik and Lyle have testified to is true.
Amongst the gathered family, was there anyone who had anything good to say about Jose Menendez?
The prosecution actually had a hard time putting on a witness that would say something nice about Jose Menendez, and I think that's very telling. one of the few people that would get up and say something positive about Jose Menendez was his assistant at the office. Her name is Margie Eisenberg. And Margie Eisenberg was on the witness stand. She told a very fanciful story about being in a limousine with Erik and Lyle Menendez on the way to the memorial service for Jose and Kitty. And Margie claimed that Lyle was flexing his shoes, flexing his feet. And he said, I'm not worried about stepping into my father's shoes. These are my father's shoes. And in fact, that's the opening scene in the Monster series on Netflix. And the reality is that never happened. When I was covering the second trial for one of the LA TV stations, I dug through their archives and I found the videotape of the brothers walking into the DGA memorial service. And Lyle Menendez was wearing a pair of green cowboy boots. He was not wearing brown tassel loafers, as Miss Eisenberg testified to. So out of the entire world, all they found was one witness who would talk about what a great man Jose Menendez was.
It's incredible. You, in fact, met the Menendez brothers before they were arrested, even before they were suspects.
That's correct. I had a phone call in the newsroom at the Miami Herald where I was writing for the Sunday magazine on August 21st, 1989. And the phone call I received the morning after the killing of Jose and Kitty Menendez was from a close friend of mine who was the editor of a trade magazine for the home video business. And he told me about that a high-profile home video executive and his wife had been killed the night before in Beverly Hills. And the reason that my friend called me was that Jose was Cuban-American. And so that made it of potential interest to people in Miami. And what I did a couple of days later, I found out a couple of days later that Jose Menendez had a sister, Marcano, who lived in West Palm Beach, about 90 minutes north of Miami. And so using 1989 technology, I got out the phone book and I looked her up and she was listed and I called her and she immediately invited me up to meet her. And we spent 4 hours talking that first day, not about the murder investigation, but she was telling me the family history, which started in Spain and then followed a path to Cuba and then to the States. And in each country, the Menendez family had been poor, and then they became very wealthy. And then when Franco came in Spain, they lost everything and immigrated to Cuba, were poor once again, became very wealthy. And then Castro came in Cuba, and they lost everything. And then they immigrated to the U.S., and once again, they repeated that pattern of being poor and becoming wealthy all over again. Jose Menendez had been living a country club lifestyle in Havana. He was really happy, he was enjoying the lifestyle he was living. And overnight, he was living with distant relatives in an attic in northeastern Pennsylvania, and he was penniless. So Jose Menendez vowed that someday that he would get back at Castro. And so the first day I met Marta Cano, she told me a story that Jose Menendez had a 5-year plan in which he wanted to retire from the entertainment business, buy a compound in Miami for the entire family to live at, and he was going to run for the U.S. Senate from Florida. And his hope was to become a U.S. Senator, become the first Cuban-American U.S. Senator, and to oust Castro from Cuba. So that was my hook right there. The story I was assigned in the fall of 1989 was to write a biography about Jose Menendez. Rags to riches, immigrant saga ends in this terrible tragedy. And Erik and Lyle Menendez were not suspects publicly when I met them 2 months after the killings and 5 months before they were arrested. And they told me very loving, caring stories about their parents and how much they missed them.
And how did you find them? Did you take them at face value?
Erik and Lyle Menendez were definitely not the characters that the actors are portraying in the TV series Monsters on Netflix. They were shy, they were quiet, they were somewhat conservative. They were not party animals. They were, they were classic jocks. They were nationally ranked tennis players, and many of their friends told me that Lyle Menendez's favorite drink was a tequila sunrise, which back in the 80s, that had kind of a girly reputation. They also told me that he liked wine coolers. So you see two brothers that are portrayed in the Monsters TV series, and the real Menendez brothers were nothing like that.
Weren't greedy, weren't spoilt, entitled.
This was a wealthy upper-class family. They spent money very freely. So I think the whole spending spree was blown out of proportion into something that the media really set as the agenda for the story. But here's one fact that's very important to know. In August of '92, about a year before the brothers went on trial, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office presented evidence to a grand jury of murder for financial gain. And over 5 days, people testified. The DA's office presented documents to the grand jury. The grand jury did not return an indictment on those charges. And yet, that didn't stop the prosecutors for a moment. They knew the media loved that story. Greedy rich kids kill Ozzie and Harriet on a Sunday night in Beverly Hills. And that was not the real story, but that didn't stop the prosecutors from hammering away at greedy rich kids, greedy rich kids, greedy rich kids. And the spending spree was brought out as part of their explanation for why Erik and Lyle Menendez had killed their parents.
Given the all-American, despite the immigrant links, but the all-American, very wealthy, well-to-do and happy family that people perceived the Menendez family to live, how big a splash, and given the location of where this terrible crime took place and the nature of the crime, how big a splash did these murders make in Beverly Hills at that time and across the United States?
Well, it's interesting that there were 7 months between the crime and the arrest of the brothers. And so, again, you have to remember back to 1989. There was no internet. There was no social media. So the Menendez murder story was really only on the national media radar for about a week or 10 days. And then it disappeared for months. And the only people that were following the case were myself and 2 reporters from the LA Times. And so then the brothers were arrested in March of 1990, and the story blew up. It became a sensation, not only in the States, but around the world. I probably wrote dozens of articles for foreign magazines in the months that followed, and I wrote a cover story for People magazine in the States that was with the headline on the cover, "Murder in Beverly Hills." This was the movie business, kids killing their parents, very, very wealthy family. So it had all the buzzwords that brought in people. And then the first trial was covered live on Court TV, gavel to gavel, a new cable channel, and people all over the world were following this case like a soap opera, like a novella. Every day they would sit glued to their TV sets and they would watch this trial develop and watch the witnesses testify.
As somebody who'd met the brothers, what was your reaction when they were arrested?
By the time Erik and Lyle Menendez were arrested, I knew that the Beverly Hills police were focused solely on them and only on them. And actually, the day that Lyle Menendez was arrested, I hadn't seen March Cano, Jose's sister, for a couple months. And so I went up to Palm Beach from Miami to have lunch with her. And the only thing we talked about during that lunch in March of 1990 was that the police appeared to solely be focused on Erik and Lyle Menendez as the suspects in their parents' killings. However, Marcia Cano told me, as she had over the previous 7 months, that she thought there was no way that they were involved in the deaths of their parents. But I left her and I stopped by my mother's house in Palm Beach. And again, 1990s technology, I checked my answering machine to pick up messages. And there was a frantic message from the Miami Herald saying that Lyle Menendez had just been arrested in Beverly Hills, and they needed me to come into the newsroom right away to write a story for the next morning's paper. And so before I went home to Miami, I went back to the office of Marticano, and I wanted her to hear from me what was going on. And she saw me at the end of the hallway, and her face just fell. It was, a terrible shock, but she knew why I was there. And I told her what had happened, and that was the way she learned that her nephew had been arrested.
Yeah, and again, for you, I know you didn't have a long relationship with them or you didn't know them particularly well, but as someone who had met them, who could characterise what they were like, what was your reaction when they were arrested? Had you ever considered that they might be responsible for this?
Well, certainly by the time that they were arrested, I was aware that they were the sole suspects in the case. But I had done so much talking to Marticano, the sister of Jose Menendez, and also the sister of Kitty Menendez, Joan Vandermolen, that they were convinced that the brothers could not be responsible for the deaths of their parents. And so I was believing, what I was hearing from them. But I knew that the Beverly Hills police were focused solely on the brothers as the primary suspects.
Did they strike you as people who were good liars at the time? People who could carry off a huge lie?
Well, actually, I went on a TV show a few days after they were arrested, and I said, I think Erik Menendez is not responsible for these killings, and if he is responsible, he is the world's greatest actor, because he sat for 3 hours with me in a separate interview from when I met with Lyle and Erik together. And Erik told me hours of stories of how close-knit the family was, how much he loved his parents, how much he missed his parents. And at one point during the interview, I said to Erik, look, I'm not writing a story about the murder investigation, but I have to ask you about the night you came home and found the bodies of your parents. And we talked for about 10 or 12 minutes about that. And right at that point, the audio cassette in my tape recorder ran out. And Erik was crying softly. And he said, can we stop talking about this? It's very hard for me to talk about that night. But one of the things he told me when we were talking about the night of the killings was that he said, I wish that I had been home. I wish that I could have done something. I would have given my life for my dad's. I'm so sorry they're not here anymore.
And you believed him?
Yes.
What does that make him? The greatest actor in the world? A great liar?
Or maybe both.
You talk about the prosecution presenting a case of greed, that's what motivated these terrible murders. The defence had another reason, of course, another motivation, and that was a terrible torture and abuse, sexual abuse of both brothers. How was that received in the States at the time?
Well, I think that people were only hearing one side of the story for 3 years. In hindsight, I believe the defense made a terrible tactical mistake, and they chose not to go public with the stories of how the brothers had been abused until 2 weeks before the first trial. So for 3 years, the only story that the general public heard was greedy rich kids killed their parents. And so when the defense went public 2 weeks before the first trial in the summer of 1993, the reaction by the general public was, well, why haven't we heard this before? And why are we just hearing it now? And of course, the supporters of the prosecution were saying, well, the defense is totally fabricated. They're just making this up. They're trying to save themselves from going to the gas chamber in California. And this entire defense is fabricated.
Was it about the time also, the timing of when the allegations of sexual abuse were made that didn't sit easily with society, that it wasn't easy for people to accept that these two young men had been abused? It would have been more readily acceptable if these two men were two sisters.
Well, actually, Leslie Abramson had a very telling line in her closing argument at the first trial. And she said, if my client's name was Erica instead of Erik, would you have an easier time believing his story? And that's true, because society has evolved so much in the past 30 years. Today we have the hashtag #MeToo movement. We have the hashtag #MenToo movement. A younger generation, the supporters of the Menendez brothers that are involved in social media every day, they're posting incredible things, and they're doing edits, and they're watching that entire trial, which is streaming live on, streaming on the Court TV cable channel. And so I think that society has evolved a great deal in 30 years, that now we are willing to accept that these things happen to boys as well as young women. And that was not something that was going on. That was not something people believed 30 years ago. I interviewed all 24 jurors after the first trial. There were 2 juries, one for each brother, because some evidence only applied to one brother or the other brother. So I interviewed all 24 jurors after the first trial. All of the women had voted for manslaughter, which is still a murder conviction, but it's a lesser penalty. All of the men had voted for murder. And every single man told me after the first trial, well, a father would never do that to his sons. And so that was the problem. It was really divided along gender lines, and the men just wouldn't budge.
Did you believe that these brothers were in fear of their lives, that they truly thought that their mother and father would kill them? I
do believe that Erik and Lyle Menendez, that they thought that they were in fear for their lives. They thought their parents were going to kill them. Kitty Menendez actually had 2 loaded rifles in her closet upstairs. But in order to understand what Erik and Lyle Menendez were thinking, you can't think through the prism of somebody who has a normal thought process. You have to understand the way that an abuse survivor thinks. And as I've had it explained to me by a number of therapy experts, Erik and Lyle Menendez were living in a tunnel. They were totally dependent on their parents. One example was their parents used to do all of their homework because their homework had to be perfect. And it didn't take teachers very long to figure out the homework was always pristine, and then they would take a pop quiz or a test in class, and they'd fail. So Jose and Kitty Menendez made their sons very dependent on them, and that is actually something that is quite typical for abuse victims, is that their parents make them dependent on themselves. And so the number one question that I'm asked is, they were 18 and 21. They were athletes. Why didn't they just walk out the front door? Why did they stay in that house? And the answer to that question is that Erik and Lyle Menendez could not imagine walking out that front door. They thought that no matter what, if they were to walk away, that Jose Menendez would hunt them down and he would kill them. He told them day after day after day, I will kill you if you ever try to get away. And that's quite a typical threat that abusers use with abuse victims, particularly children, in which they say, I will kill you if you leave.
Do you believe that he would have? Do you believe that Jose Menendez would have killed his sons?
Again, it's hard for us to, through the prism of thinking about the situation like a normal person, it's difficult to accept that this may have been the way the brothers were thinking. But I believe he was totally capable of killing his sons. As I said, Kitty Menendez had 2 loaded rifles in a closet upstairs, so who knows what they were really thinking. But they controlled every aspect of their sons' lives. With Erik, for example, his mother, Kitty, ordered him to get a girlfriend at one point. And he said, you have 6 months. You have to get a girlfriend, and it has to be a good relationship. And so the parents were very controlling of the brothers. And I know that's hard for people to understand, that, that 2 parents who appear to have it all, appear to really be on top of the world, that they would be this way with their own children. But I believe what I've heard from the family of Erik and Lyle Menendez, and that is that this was a very dysfunctional family. They were spinning wildly out of control. And so who knows if the parents actually might have killed their sons. Probably not. However, what matters in this whole story right now is, did Erik and Lyle Menendez actually believe that they were about to be killed? And there were a series of confrontations in the days leading up to the killing of Jose and Kitty Menendez, in which a lot of the family secrets were spilling out. And at one point, their mother, Kitty, said to them, "I've known about the abuse all along. What, do you think I'm stupid?" This is according to the testimony of the brothers. And so one of the other lines that Leslie Abramson had in her closing argument at the first trial was, Jose and Kitty Menendez ran boot camp Beverly Hills, and Kitty was one of the guards, not one of the prisoners.
Do you believe that she abused her sons?
There was testimony in the trial that Kitty had been abusive to her sons, not nearly as extensively as the abuse of Jose Menendez. However, the fact that Kitty Menendez knew about this abuse and didn't protect her sons, she chose her marriage over her sons. And that's just an awful thing. I have 2 children, and I can't imagine being in the situation where you would, choose a marriage over your children. I can't imagine that.
I don't know whether it's true, but the way it seems to have been portrayed is that Kitty felt her sons were sexual rivals, in a way, for the affections and attention of Jose.
As I said, the house was a very dysfunctional family lived in that house, lived in that mansion in Beverly Hills. And everybody thought they were on top of the world. They had everything. They had money, they had wealth, they had fame. The brothers were nationally ranked tennis players. But behind the walls of that mansion, it was a very different story. And so I think that Kitty Menendez was more interested in saving her marriage because of the experience she had growing up when her father actually left her family and married another woman and had 3 new children. And yet once a week, her father would come home and have a sexual relationship with their mother. And so I think the lesson she learned growing up was that you have to preserve your marriage at any cost. And I believe that's what happened in this case.
Do you believe that level of dysfunction, that level of sexual abuse suffered by the brothers is excuse, reason enough for that terribly violent double murder?
No, there's never an excuse. There's never a reason. You can't get around the elephant in the room. Erik and Lyle Menendez killed their parents. It was a very brutal murder. Shotguns are horrible weapons to kill somebody with. I've seen all the crime scene photos and the autopsy photos. They're terrible. It's, I can't unsee those images. So their crime was terrible. But if you understand the background of the family, then you have a different attitude about their punishment. They definitely should have been punished for their crime. If they'd been convicted of manslaughter, they would have gone to state prison in California for 22 years. And instead, the jury in the second trial did not hear most of the abuse evidence because the judge reversed almost all of his evidence rulings from the first trial. In the first Menendez trial, there were 53 witnesses, teachers, coaches, family members, friends, relatives that testified, and very few of those witnesses were allowed to testify in the second trial until the brothers were convicted of first-degree murder. And then there was a second phase of the trial called the penalty phase. And during that part of the trial, the defense was allowed to put out all these witnesses that told a very detailed story of a dysfunctional family and a story of abuse. And I spoke with 4 of the jurors off the record from the second trial, and they told me if they had heard that evidence in the guilt phase of the trial, they never would have voted for first-degree murder. So that's the problem. There's the fix. There's the collusion that a justice in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals talked about in a hearing, appeal hearing in 2005, one of the justices said that he believed there had been collusion between the DA's office and the trial judge, Stanley Weisberg, to convict the brothers in the second trial. And a lot of this is connected to politics in Los Angeles County. The LA County DA's office had lost 4 or 5 high-profile trials, and the second Menendez trial had the misfortune of starting a week after the acquittal of O.J. Simpson. And so everybody wanted a conviction in this trial. The LA County DA's office knew that. And if this had not been a high-profile trial, there simply would have been a plea agreement after the 6-month-long first trial. And instead, Gil Garcetti, the DA, was running for re-election in March. And so within 15 minutes after the 2 mistrials were declared, he didn't hesitate to go on live TV in Los Angeles and say, this is a case of first-degree murder, and we are going to retry this case, and we are going to convict those brothers. And they did.
And how would you describe the way that that trial and those decisions were conducted?
In the second trial, Judge Stanley Weisberg reversed almost all of his evidence rulings from the first trial. The defense was not allowed to put on the heart of their case. In the first trial, there were 53 teachers, coaches, family, friends, relatives who testified and presented to the juries a very detailed story of what life was like in the Menendez family. And that picture that was presented was not the story that people on the outside thought about this family.
How would you describe the approach by the judge in the second trial?
In the second trial, Judge Stanley Weisberg reversed almost all of his evidence rulings. He severely limited the testimony that the defense was allowed to put on. And so the defense was never allowed to put on most of their witnesses from the heart of their case in the first trial. And in his closing argument, David Kahn, who was the lead prosecutor in the second trial, actually stood up and said, "You've heard no evidence of abuse in this trial, so therefore the abuse never happened." Well, David Kahn had actually made sure to keep out all of that evidence, and therefore that's why the jury didn't hear that.
You've described that in the past as a travesty of justice. Is that how you would describe it today?
I believe the second trial was a complete miscarriage of justice. I don't think it was a fair trial. I believe that there was collusion, as Justice Alex Kosinski said in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2005. I think there was collusion between trial judge Stanley Weisberg and the LA County DA's office to convict the brothers in the second trial. Politically, they were on the rocks. They had suffered terrible defeats in a number of high-profile trials, and the O.J. Simpson trial was, the acquittal was right before the second Menendez trial started. So they were determined that they were going to convict the Menendez brothers, and they did.
Do you believe that you and your team have uncovered evidence that would vacate the murder conviction of the Menendez brothers?
There are 2 different pieces of new evidence. There's a letter that Erik Menendez wrote to his cousin Andy Cano, the son of Marcia Cano, Jose's sister, in late 1988 when Erik was 17 and Andy was 15. And Erik and Andy were very close cousins, and they had lived together near each other their entire lives. And then Andy moved to Puerto Rico with his family. And so they were writing quite a few letters. They had phone calls almost daily. And in the letter that Erik Menendez wrote to his cousin Andy Cano in 1988, he complained about the ongoing sexual abuse by Jose Menendez that he was experiencing. And it was still going on at the age of 17. And so what happened was that in March of 2018, I was on the final deadline for my original Menendez book, and Andy tragically died of an accidental sleeping pill overdose in 2003. His room had been untouched for 15 years, and I was staying visiting his mother, Marcia Cano, and she invited me to take a look through a dresser full of his personal papers, in case I saw anything. that might be relevant to the trial. And within 15 minutes, I found that letter. And as soon as I read that paragraph, I thought to myself, this could have a major impact on the case. And so I literally hand carried the letter. I knew how important it was. I didn't want to leave it up to FedEx. I hand carried that letter from West Palm Beach over to the office of the brothers' appellate attorney, Cliff Gardner, in Berkeley, California. And he locked it away in a safe immediately. And so that's one key piece of evidence that is cited in their habeas corpus petition, in which they are trying to reopen their case. Normally, you are allowed a certain number of state and federal appeals in California, and once you have exhausted those appeals, the only way that you can reopen your case is if you come forward with new evidence that was not available at the time you were on trial, and you say, we have this new evidence, so therefore you go in front of a judge and say, we would like to reopen our case. In addition to the letter, I was the co-EP and co-creator of a documentary that came out last year called Menendez plus Menudo, Boys Betrayed. And that 3-episode documentary reveals the nefarious connection between Jose Menendez when he was head of RCA Records and the Latin boy band Menudo. And, many people were very surprised to hear that there could be any sort of connection between the head of a record label and a pop boy band, but there was. And 30 years ago, I started hearing rumors that there was some sort of nefarious connection between Jose Menendez when he was at RCA Records and the boy band Menudo. And so I actually interviewed Ricky Martin in December of '93 when he was a former member of Menudo. It was about 6 years before Livin' La Vida Loca. We talked extensively, and at the end of the interview, he said, everything I've just told you is off the record, and I will never, come forward and say anything that happened to me.
But he had said what had happened to you in the conversation. Before he said it was off the record, he detailed what happened to him?
I've never revealed the details of that conversation because I believe that I have a moral and ethical duty to him, that if he wants to come forward and tell his own story, that's up to him. I'm not going to come forward. I mean, normally in journalism, you are not allowed to say at the end of an interview, by the way, everything I've just told you for 3 hours is off the record. That's not how journalism works. However, I've never revealed what Ricky Martin told me that afternoon in Mexico City, because I consider that that is Ricky's personal story to come forward and tell, if he ever wants to tell it. And what we've learned through our research over several years of the documentary is some people actually carry the secrets of being abuse survivors to their graves. They never tell anybody. If they do talk about what they experienced, that frequently happens later in their lives when they've, just feel comfortable talking about things. And so we had a very short list of the people that were the boys that were members of Menudo at the time that Jose Menendez was head of RCA Records. And so we were going through all the boys on that list, and we talked to all of them, but nobody else would go on the record except Roy Rossello. Roy Rossello was a member of Menudo in what's called the golden era of the band in the 1980s. And Roy Rossello spent months talking to my reporting partner, Neri Inclan, explaining about how he was abused over a period of years by Edgardo Diaz, who was the founder and creator and manager of Menudo. And after about 7 or 8 months, one day Roy said to Neri, I know that guy who was killed by his sons in Beverly Hills. And Neri said, what guy? And Roy said, Jose Menendez. And we never wanted to, put information in Roy's head or really talk about anything. We wanted whatever happened, whatever he was going to tell us, we wanted that to happen naturally. And so it took about 7 or 8 months, and he brought up Jose Menendez, but he really didn't want to talk about it. we certainly had an idea that he was one of the people that might have been molested by Jose Menendez, but Roy was very reluctant to talk about it, and that's the same thing that happened with Erik Menendez and Dr. William Vickery, who is the lead defense therapy expert. When Erik Menendez first revealed a tiny bit of information about having been abused by his father, Dr. Vickery told me it was like pulling teeth to get any information out of him. And Dr. Vickery shared with me that you can always tell the people that are faking it because you walk in the first day and they tell you a very open, detailed story of the abuse they experienced. And that wasn't what Dr. Vickery experienced with Erik and Lyle Menendez.
You have no doubt that Roy is telling the truth, and you have no doubt that the letter to Andy from Erik is the real thing?
I believe the letter is absolutely the real thing. They exchanged hundreds of letters. People have said to me, well, Andy Cano was a key defense witness in the first trial. He testified that when Erik was 12 and Andy was 10 years old, that Erik asked him one day, does your father ever massage your genitals? And Andy was kind of shocked by the question, and he immediately wanted to go to his mother and ask her about, what Erik had just told him. And Andy and Erik made a pinky promise. Erik made his cousin swear that he would never tell anybody about what he had revealed to him. And so their relationship was very close. You can see that when you watch the testimony of Andy Cano in the first trial. And so I believe the letter was one of maybe hundreds of letters that the two cousins exchanged with each other. And I think that's something that, I understand that's hard for people to believe. Well, how could this cousin have testified in the first trial, but he didn't remember this letter? But again, if you've exchanged hundreds of letters with your cousin when you're a teenager, are you going to remember every single letter and every single thing that you wrote and that he wrote to you? So the answer to your second question, let's talk about Roy Rossello. So Roy Rossello eventually told us that he had been molested by Jose Menendez, that he had been raped by Jose Menendez. And he told a very detailed story over a period of time. Once again, it was very difficult to get information out of him. He was reluctant to talk about it. He had never told his mother. He had never told his brother. It was just a very, difficult subject for him. Roy had tried to commit suicide 5 different times in the years after he was in Menudo. He was really a mess, but he was able to find new faith in being a pastor and going around Brazil, where he lives now, and talking to people and speaking in front of other abuse survivors. And so he was able to come back from the brink of killing himself to becoming a very valuable member of society. But what I want people to know is my reporting partner, Neri Inclan, and I spent 2 years corroborating Roy's story. We didn't just publish what Roy said and say, Roy said this, so it must be true. We spent 2 years corroborating the story. We did what journalists do. We went out and found other members of the band. We found people that had toured with the band. We found a photographer who's in the documentary who had traveled with the band for 10 years. And they all knew bits and pieces of a puzzle, but they didn't put the whole story together until a photographer named Bolivar Arellano first tried to go to the media in the spring of 1991 and talk about that there was molestation going on in Menudo. For one day, the New York Daily News ran a front page headline in moon type, Menudo Sex Shocker. And the story that went with that headline was a column by a Daily News columnist who had talked with Bolivar Arellano, the photographer who had tried to expose what he believed was a scandal going on in the group. And so a few days later, Bolivar Arellano held a news conference in New York City, and nobody showed up. This was a Latin boy band. American audiences didn't really care about menudo. By 1991, menudo was no longer in their prime, so very few people were following them in the States. And so what Bolivar Arellano did was he went to Puerto Rico, and he appeared live on a TV show hosted by a very well-known journalist in Puerto Rico named Carmen Jove. And Mr. Arellano explained, everything that he knew. And there were other people that were on the TV show. And what happened was that Edgardo Diaz, the founder and manager of Menudo, was so powerful that before that TV show was over, it was a live show in a studio in San Juan, 6 police officers showed up at the studio, and they were there to arrest Bolivar Arellano for defamation of Edgardo Diaz. The police didn't arrest Bolivar that first day. A week later, he was back on the same TV show telling more about the scandal. And this time the police did arrest him and carried him off in handcuffs from the TV studio where he was appearing live. And he was charged with defamation of Edgardo Diaz. So that's how powerful Edgardo Diaz was. He was a heavy contributor to politicians in Puerto Rico. He was connected to the Justice Department in Puerto Rico. And Menudo had become very important to the island of Puerto Rico because people were becoming interested in tourism in Puerto Rico because of Menudo being introduced to the island, being introduced to the territory through the Menudo music.
Why is Roy so critical to Erik and Lyle's case?
Roy Rossello is such a critical witness to the murder case of Erik and Lyle Menendez because there has never been another victim of Jose Menendez that has come forward and said, I was raped by Jose Menendez, until Roy Rossello came forward last year and said that that had happened to him. And so the reason that is so important is because now we have somebody who is outside the family, somebody independent of Erik and Lyle Menendez, who has come forward and said that he was molested by Jose Menendez. My reporting partner, Neri Inclan, and I spent 2 years corroborating Roy's story. We interviewed a number of people who were in the band, people who toured with the band, people who worked with the band, and we believe Roy Rossello is telling the truth.
Just in terms of the resentencing of the Menendez brothers, there's a new DA in town. Do you think that resentencing will go ahead?
I really don't know what's going to happen. George Gascon had been the DA of LA County for the last 4 years. And several weeks ago, George Gascon, who had been the DA in LA County for the last several years, held a news conference, and he announced that he was recommending that Erik and Lyle Menendez be resentenced. Mr. Gascon did not say that he was going to vacate their murder convictions. He said they are still guilty of this terrible crime they committed. But Mr. Gascon was more interested in what they had done with their lives over the last 30 years, their lives in prison. They've spent more of their life incarcerated than they have been free people. And what the most important quote that George Gascon said during his news conference was that Erik and Lyle Menendez never thought that they were going to get out of prison. They thought they were in for life without parole, which really means that in California. And they chose a path of redemption. They chose to be of service to their inmate community. They chose to counsel fellow abuse survivors. They chose to create what's called the Green Space Project, where they were painting an enormous mural on the interior of their prison wall, and they're going to take a patch of brown dirt and create a beautiful garden. And, that's remarkable to walk inside a prison as I have and see this incredible piece of art, incredible work of art. And Erik Menendez was the lead painter. He had a number of other inmates that were helping him. And Lyle Menendez is in charge of this project.
Sorry, but being so close to potentially being released, has that been taken away now with the appointment of a new DA?
Brian Freeman is an attorney who represents the family members, the majority of whom want to see Erik and Lyle Menendez released from prison. And this afternoon, Brian Freeman said, "Childhood sexual abuse is not gender-based, and a failure to recognize that sets an extremely dangerous precedent. Politics should not stand in the way of doing the right thing. I would find it hard to believe Nathan Hochman would feel differently." And I think that's where we're at. Nathan Hochman is upset with George Gascon. He has accused George Gascon of simply recommending that the Menendez brothers be resentenced and set free as a last-minute Hail Mary pass in their race for the DA of LA County. And now Nathan Hochman is the new DA of LA County, and he has said, well, I need to review this case. I need to go through the trial transcripts. I need to review the prison records, which are pristine. And so that could delay the release of the brothers. 2 weeks ago, the media was reporting Erik and Lyle Menendez are going to be home for the holidays. They'll be released from prison, and isn't this great? They're going to be resentenced. The family had a news conference in which they spoke lovingly how much they missed their nephews and were hoping to be reunited with their nephews, and that has never happened. What has happened in the past few weeks is that Nathan Hochman has been elected the DA of LA County, and now Nathan Hochman is making noise about, well, we don't want to rush into this decision. And I want to review the records. I want to review transcripts. And so what I believe is going to happen now is that there are two Superior Court judges who are assigned, one to the resentencing ruling, the recommendation by DA Gascon that they be resentenced. And there's a separate judge who is assigned to the habeas corpus petition, which has the new evidence that we revealed in Menendez plus Menudo, Boys Betrayed, and also includes the letter that Erik Menendez wrote in 1988 to his cousin Andy. So I believe that the two judges are going to make the brothers jump through a number of hoops. They're not just going to walk out as easily as it sounded 2 weeks ago. And some of those hoops include appearing before the California Parole Board and testifying about their rehabilitation, what has really happened to them over the past 30 years. And I believe they will be successful. I believe they will eventually be let out, but it could be another 6 months, 8 months. It could be a year until they get out. But eventually, I believe they will be let out. They should be let out. They should be reunited with their wives. They should be sent home to their family. This case needs to end.
Just finally, 35 years ago, when you were assigned to this story, could you have ever imagined that you might be instrumental in getting them out of jail?
No. If you had talked to me 35 years ago and you said, 35 years in the future, you'll still be covering this case, and you'll not only be covering this case, but you'll be instrumental in the release of the brothers from prison, I would have laughed. I would have said, that's not going to happen. And yet, here we are.